The cold January morning in 2019 dawned with an unsettling event on Maple Street. 6 unmarked police cruisers quietly rolled up to a modest 2-story house in Huntington, West Virginia. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as officers in tactical gear took positions around the property. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski was preparing his morning coffee, a ritual he had followed for nearly 5 decades, having been a respected high school teacher, community volunteer, and beloved grandfather to 4 grandchildren. The sharp rap at his door came at precisely 7:32 a.m. David Kowalski? West Virginia State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1971 murder of Catherine Fitzgerald. The officers later recounted how the elderly man's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his coffee mug, yet his face remained eerily calm, as if he had been anticipating this moment for a lifetime. March 16, 1971. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Marshall University satellite campus in Cabell County. Patricia Wilson, a sophomore studying education, knocked repeatedly on her friend Catherine's dorm room door. She always meets me for breakfast on Tuesdays. Patricia later told detectives, when she didn't show up for class either, I knew something was wrong. Campus security discovered 22-year-old Catherine Fitzgerald sprawled on her dorm room floor, strangled with her own scarf. Her textbooks lay open on her desk, notes only partially completed, a coffee cup still retaining some warmth. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle, simply the tragic end of a brilliant young life without warning or explanation. For 50 years, the individual who took Catherine's life continued to reside just miles from the scene of the crime. He attended community events where her parents spoke, with tears in their eyes, about their immeasurable loss. He read newspaper articles commemorating the anniversaries of the case growing cold. He watched as Catherine's younger sister became a prosecutor, driven by the profound injustice of her sister's unsolved murder. The killer coached Little League, served on the school board, and was even recognized as Citizen of the Year in 1997. He sent Christmas cards to detectives who had previously interviewed him as a person of interest, only to subsequently clear his name. For 5 decades, he maintained a facade of respectability while concealing the darkest secret in the history of Cabell County. How did this respected member of the community manage to evade justice for half a century? What ultimately led investigators to his doorstep after countless fruitless leads? And, perhaps most unsettling of all, how many lives unknowingly crossed paths with a killer who lived among them, hiding in plain sight? Before we reveal how this predator was finally apprehended and the groundbreaking forensic techniques that solved this most frigid of cold cases, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Our channel brings you the most gripping true crime stories, providing details often omitted from mainstream news coverage. Subscribe right now, so you don't miss a single detail of this extraordinary story of delayed justice. Catherine Ann Fitzgerald was born to Elizabeth and Michael Fitzgerald on June 12, 1948, in Charleston, West Virginia. As the eldest of 3 children, Catherine, known as Kathy to everyone, was described by family and friends as a thoughtful, determined, and quietly ambitious young woman. Her father was employed as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department, while her mother taught piano lessons from their modest family residence on Kanawha Boulevard. From a young age, Catherine displayed a natural aptitude for science that distinguished her from her peers. In an era when women were generally expected to pursue careers in teaching, nursing, or homemaking, Catherine had set her sights on medicine. Her high school yearbook caption stated, "Plans to attend Marshall University and become a doctor." This was an ambitious dream for a working-class girl from West Virginia in the late 1960s. She was brilliant, but never flaunted it. Her younger sister, Margaret, recalled in a 2015 interview, "When I struggled with homework, she'd help me figure it out myself instead of just giving me the answer." That's who she was. Always teaching, always believing in people's potential. Catherine graduated as valedictorian from Charleston High School in 1967 and became the first member of her family to attend college when she Enrolled at Marshall University's main campus in Huntington. After 2 successful years, she transferred to the smaller satellite campus in Cabell County to concentrate on her pre-med studies, where the student-to-faculty ratio allowed for more personalized instruction. By 1971, Catherine was flourishing academically. Her professors consistently lauded her work, especially in organic chemistry and biology. She resided in Sycamore Hall, a women's dormitory that housed approximately 80 female students. Her roommate had withdrawn mid-semester due to family matters, leaving Catherine with a private room, rare privilege for a college student at that time. In 1971, the Marshall Satellite Campus consisted of 5 red brick buildings nestled in the rolling foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. With just over 120 students, it fostered a tight-knit community atmosphere that Catherine preferred over the busier main campus. The town of Milton in Cabell County had a population of around 3,000. It was a place where people often left their doors unlocked and where everyone seemed to know each other. Milton was the kind of place where the worst crime was usually kids tipping over mailboxes on Halloween, said retired Sheriff Jim Holloway. We had our share of domestic squabbles and the occasional bar fight, but violent crime? That wasn't part of our reality here. On campus, Catherine had cultivated a small, close-knit circle of friends. She worked part-time in the university library, attended meetings of the pre-medical society, and volunteered weekly at Cabell County Hospital. Her diary, recovered from her dorm room, revealed a young woman who was mindful of her schedule, dedicated to her studies, and carefully planning a future that would tragically never materialize. March 15, 1971, the day preceding her murder, began like any other Monday for Catherine. According to statements from classmates and professors, as well as her own diary entry from that morning, she attended her 8:30 a.m. comparative anatomy class, followed by advanced chemistry at 11 a.m. She had lunch with her friend Patricia Wilson at the campus cafeteria around 1:15 p.m., where they discussed an upcoming biology exam. She seemed completely normal. Patricia later told detectives, "We talked about studying together that weekend. She was worried about the enzyme section, but that was just Kathy being Kathy. She always worried even though she'd end up with the highest grade." From 2:30 to 5 o'clock p.m., Catherine worked her shift at the library. The head librarian, Doris Malone, recalled that Catherine had seemed especially focused that day, reorganizing the medical reference section and assisting a professor in locating obscure journal articles. At 5:30 p.m., security cameras captured Catherine entering the dining hall for dinner, where she ate alone while reviewing her notes. She checked out 2 books from the library at 7:15 p.m. before returning to her dorm room. At 9:20 p.m., she called her parents, a Monday night ritual confirmed by phone records and her mother's statement. She talked about coming home the following weekend. Elizabeth Fitzgerald recalled in her initial police interview, she wanted to celebrate her father's birthday. She sounded happy, making plans for the future. Catherine's final diary entry, written shortly before midnight on March 15, read, "Tired but accomplished today. Need to finish chemistry problem set before Wilson's class. Remember to mail Dad's card tomorrow. Summer internship application due Friday. Review once more." The following morning, Catherine was found dead. Between these ordinary moments in a dedicated student's life and the horror of her murder lies a gap of approximately 9 hours. What transpired in Catherine's dorm room between midnight and the discovery of her body at 9:15 a.m. remains the central mystery that haunted investigators for decades. These details of Catherine's life, her aspirations, her routines, her relationships, would later become crucial pieces of the puzzle, as investigators attempted to understand not only how she died but also who might have wanted to kill a promising young woman with no known enemies and seemingly nothing to hide. As we continue to explore this remarkable case, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Whether you're in West Virginia, where this story unfolded, or thousands of miles away, true crime has a way of connecting us all to the fundamental questions of justice and human behavior. Let us know in the comments below as we continue to uncover the truth behind one of America's most baffling cold cases. At 9:17 a.m. on March 16, 1971, campus security officer Robert Gaines radioed the Cabell County Sheriff's Department using a code that hadn't been used in the county for over a decade. 10:31. Possible homicide, Sycamore Hall, room 214. The timestamp of that call marked the official commencement of what would become West Virginia's most enduring murder investigation. Patricia Wilson's morning had begun with a mild sense of annoyance, which evolved into concern and ultimately terror. When Catherine failed to meet her for their regular Tuesday breakfast at 7:30 a.m., Patricia initially assumed her friend had simply overslept. By 8:45 a.m., after Catherine missed their shared biology lecture, something she had never done before, Patricia's worry intensified to the point that she decided to skip the rest of class and check on her friend. "I knocked several times," Patricia recalled during her witness statement. "At first normal, then harder. I called out her name. The door was locked, which wasn't unusual, but the silence was." Catherine was always an early riser. Patricia sought out the resident advisor, 22-year-old Elaine Summers, who used her master key to open the door after her own knocks went unanswered. "I'll never forget Patricia's scream," Elaine later testified. "It didn't even sound human. I looked past her shoulder and saw Catherine on the floor. I pulled Patricia back, closed the door, and ran to call security. Officer Gaines arrived within minutes and secured the scene." His incident report described what he found. Female victim, approximately 20 to 25 years of age, lying supine on the floor between the desk and bed. Ligature marks visible on neck. No signs of life. Room undisturbed, door locked. Window closed. Sheriff Thomas Hayward and Detective Frank Mullins arrived at 9:42 a.m., followed 20 minutes later by County Medical Examiner Dr. Howard Levitt. By 10:30 a.m., the small campus was swarming with law enforcement as news of the murder spread throughout the shocked community. The initial scene assessment raised several immediate concerns. Detective Mullins wrote in his case notes, "The victim appeared to have been strangled with what we later identified as her own scarf. There was no sign of forced entry. The room was neat and orderly except for the area immediately surrounding the body. Most peculiarly, there were 2 coffee cups on the desk, both apparently used recently. This detail, the second coffee cup, became the most tantalizing and frustrating piece of evidence in the case. It suggested Catherine had willingly admitted her killer into her room, likely someone she knew and trusted enough to share a late-night coffee." Dr. Levitt's preliminary examination at the scene established the time of death as being between 11:30 p.m. Monday night and 2:30 a.m. Tuesday morning. Catherine was dressed in jeans and a Marshall University sweatshirt. Not sleepwear, indicating that she hadn't been preparing for bed when she was killed. The ligature marks show consistent pressure application. Dr. Levitt noted in his initial report. The perpetrator approached from behind, using considerable force. Death would have occurred within minutes. The victim likely had minimal opportunity to defend herself. Indeed, the only signs of a struggle were defensive bruising on Catherine's forearms and broken fingernails on her right hand. The killer had been both swift and powerful. As investigators processed the scene, they made several observations that would shape the initial investigation. Catherine's wallet remained untouched in her purse with $43 inside, ruling out robbery as a motive. Her class notes were still open on her desk beside the 2 coffee cups, suggesting that she might have been studying when her visitor arrived. Her door had been locked from the inside with a key that was later found in her pocket, a detail that confounded investigators. Either the killer had their own key, which was highly unlikely given the university's strict key control, or they locked the door from inside and exited through the window. Detective Mullins theorized. The window, however, showed no signs of having been opened, and the 3-story drop would have been difficult to navigate without sustaining injuries. By noon, news of the murder had spread beyond the campus to the wider community. Local radio stations interrupted their regular programming to broadcast special bulletins. The campus administration hastily called an emergency meeting, where they announced the cancellation of all classes for the remainder of the week. The phones in our office rang non-stop, recalled Linda Jenkins, who worked as a secretary in the administration building. Parents were panicking, wanting to pick up their children immediately. Students were crying in the hallways. It was like the whole world had suddenly shifted beneath our feet. The reaction from the tight-knit Milton community was equally profound. Local businesses closed early. Churches opened their doors for impromptu prayer services. The town mayor appeared on local television, urging calm while promising that no resource would be spared in bringing the criminal to justice. As investigators continued to work the crime scene throughout that Tuesday, they meticulously collected evidence that would eventually, decades later, prove crucial in solving the case. Fingerprints from the coffee cups, fibers from the carpet near the body, and microscopic skin samples from beneath Catherine's fingernails, where she had scratched her attacker. We're treating everything as potential evidence, Sheriff Hayward told reporters at a hastily arranged press conference that evening. At this stage, we have more questions than answers, but I want to assure both the campus and the wider community that this case is our absolute priority. By Wednesday morning, March 17, investigators had begun to construct a timeline of Catherine's final hours. Piecing together witness statements, security camera footage, and physical evidence. 7:15 p.m., Catherine checks out 2 books from the library. 7:30 to 8:45 p.m., Catherine is seen studying alone in the dormitory common room by several witnesses. 8:50 p.m., Catherine returns to her room, according to her hallmate, who briefly spoke with her. 9:20 p.m., Catherine calls her parents. Confirmed by phone records. 10:15 p.m., Catherine's neighbor across the hall hears what sounds like a kettle whistling in Catherine's room. 11:05 p.m., the same neighbor reports hearing muffled voices from Catherine's room. Not arguing, just conversation. 11:45 p.m. to 2:30 a.m., estimated time of death based on the medical examiner's findings. 9:15 a.m., body discovered. The investigation's first major challenge emerged when they attempted to identify who might have visited Catherine that night. Her diary contained no mention of expecting company, and none of her friends reported any plans to meet with her. The coffee cups told us someone was there, but nobody would admit to being that someone. Detective Mullins later explained. Either the killer was a stranger who somehow gained her trust instantly, or it was someone she knew well enough to invite in late at night, someone who wasn't coming forward. The second major challenge involved dormitory security. Sycamore Hall had strict visitor policies requiring guests to sign in at the front desk and leave by 10 p.m. The sign-in log for March 15 showed no visitors for Catherine, and the night guard insisted that no unauthorized persons had entered the building after hours. This led investigators to a troubling conclusion: either the killer was another dormitory resident, a university employee with access privileges, or someone who had found a way to circumvent the building's security measures. The coffee cups yielded the investigation's first substantial leads. Both contained traces of the same instant coffee brand that Catherine kept in her room. But while her fingerprints were on one cup, the other had been wiped clean, an intentional act that suggested premeditation. By Friday, March 19, investigators had interviewed 47 people, including Catherine's friends, professors, dormitory residents, and campus staff. They'd taken fingerprints from 23 potential suspects and collected hair samples from 15. Each person had provided alibis for the night in question, though not all could be immediately verified. The more we dig, the more complicated this gets, Sheriff Hayward admitted in his case notes that weekend. This wasn't a random act of violence. Someone targeted this young woman specifically, someone Comfortable enough in her presence to share a late-night coffee, someone methodical enough to clean their fingerprints afterward, and someone who knew how to enter and exit that room without being detected. As Catherine's body was released to her family for funeral services the following Monday, the investigation hit its first major roadblock. With no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, and a crime scene that raised more questions than answers, detectives found themselves chasing shadows. The funeral in Charleston drew over 400 mourners, including dozens of classmates who traveled from Cabell County. The university president delivered a eulogy praising Catherine's academic promise and personal character. Her father, stoic throughout the service, broke down only when his daughter's casket was lowered into the ground. "We demand justice for our daughter," Elizabeth Fitzgerald told reporters afterward, her voice unwavering despite her tear-streaked face. "Someone out there knows what happened to Catherine. We beg you to come forward." What neither the grieving family nor the determined investigators could have imagined that day was that justice would take half a century to arrive, or that the key to solving the case was already in their possession, preserved in an evidence box that would sit untouched for decades, waiting for science to catch up to a killer who walked freely among them. By April 1971, the initial shock of Catherine Fitzgerald's murder had evolved into something more insidious: fear. Enrollment numbers at the satellite campus dropped as parents withdrew their daughters. Female students began traveling in groups, even during daylight hours. The administration installed additional lighting and hired security guards to patrol the grounds 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, the investigation that had begun with such urgency and promise was hitting one dead end after another. Detective Frank Mullins maintained a methodical approach, establishing 3 concentric circles of suspicion around Catherine: those closest to her daily life, those who intersected with her routinely, and those who might have encountered her randomly. This approach yielded an initial suspect list of 27 individuals. "We started with the obvious," Mullins wrote in his case summary. Former boyfriends, male classmates who had shown interest in her, faculty members who had close contact with her. Catherine's most recent boyfriend, Thomas Mitchell, a graduate student at the main Marshall campus in Huntington, became the investigation's first focus. They had dated for 8 months before breaking up in January 1971. The split had been Catherine's decision, according to her diary entries. She wrote that he had become too possessive and couldn't understand how prioritizing med school over marriage. Classic motive territory, Detective Mullins noted. Mitchell was interrogated 3 times during the initial investigation. His alibi, that he was studying with classmates in Huntington, 30 miles away, was confirmed by multiple witnesses. Phone records showed he made a call from his dormitory phone at 11:30 p.m., within the estimated window of Catherine's murder. Reluctantly, investigators ruled him out. The second major suspect emerged from witness statements. Janet Meadows, who lived down the hall from Catherine, reported seeing a maintenance worker leaving the vicinity of Catherine's room around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, well after normal working hours. He didn't have any tools with him, Meadows stated. "I remember thinking that was odd, but he smiled and said good evening, so I didn't think much more about it." This led investigators to Raymond Lewis, a 43-year-old university maintenance employee with access to all dormitory buildings. Lewis had a minor criminal record, 2 disorderly conduct charges from bar fights in his 20s. Initial interviews revealed inconsistencies in his account of that evening, elevating him to prime suspect status for nearly 2 weeks. The case against Lewis collapsed when investigators discovered he had been admitted to Cabell County Hospital at 9:45 p.m. on March 15 with a broken ankle from falling off a ladder. Hospital records confirmed he remained there until the following morning, physically incapable of committing the murder. "We're not sure who Janet Meadows saw," Sheriff Hayward acknowledged in a press briefing. "But it couldn't have been Raymond Lewis." The third significant early suspect was Professor William Harris, who taught Catherine's advanced chemistry class. Several students reported that Harris had shown special interest in Catherine's academic work, often asking her to stay after class for discussions. One classmate described his behavior as borderline inappropriate. Harris voluntarily submitted to questioning and fingerprinting. His alibi, that he was home with his wife and teenage children, was corroborated. Furthermore, his fingerprints didn't match any found in Catherine's room. Despite lingering suspicions, investigators couldn't connect him to the crime scene. By late April, all 27 individuals on the initial suspect list had been investigated and cleared through alibis, forensic inconsistencies, or a lack of physical evidence connecting them to the scene. The investigation had reached its first major impasse. We're dealing with either incredible luck or calculated precision, Detective Mullins confided to Sheriff Hayward in a memo dated April 30, 1971. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. Someone planned this meticulously. The investigation then widened to include Catherine's activities beyond campus. Detectives interviewed staff at local businesses she frequented, patients she encountered during her hospital volunteer work, and even bus drivers on routes she regularly took. This expanded effort added 43 more names to the suspect list, each systematically investigated and eventually cleared. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the crime scene evidence, constrained by 1970s technology, yielded minimal results. The coffee cups had been dusted for fingerprints using primitive powder methods. The cleaned cup revealed nothing, while Catherine's cup showed only her own prints. The scarf used to strangle her contained no foreign fibers or hair that could be matched to a suspect using the technology available. Most promisingly, skin samples recovered from beneath Catherine's fingernails indicated that she had scratched her attacker, likely leaving visible marks. Investigators checked the arms, necks, and faces of every suspect interviewed, finding no suspicious scratches. The samples were preserved in the evidence locker, but DNA testing was still years away from becoming an investigative tool. Our biggest challenge wasn't just identifying suspects. It was maintaining the integrity of the evidence we did have, explained Thomas Hayward in a 1996 interview long after his retirement as sheriff. We knew what we had, but we didn't have the science to make sense of it. All we could do was preserve everything carefully and hope technology would eventually catch up. The preservation methods of the 1970s were rudimentary by modern standards. Evidence was stored in paper bags rather than plastic containers, increasing the risk of contamination. Temperature-controlled storage facilities didn't exist in Cabell County, exposing biological samples to degradation. Documentation relied on handwritten chain of custody forms that occasionally contained gaps or errors. Despite these limitations, Detective Mullins insisted on extraordinary care with the Catherine Fitzgerald evidence. He personally supervised the packaging and storage of all items, implementing stricter protocols than were standard for the era. This foresight would ultimately prove crucial decades later. By summer 1971, media interest in the case began to wane. Local newspapers reduced coverage from front-page stories to occasional updates buried in later sections. Television stations moved on to newer headlines. The fading public attention concerned the investigators, who worried that potential witnesses might forget important details as time passed. In June, a potentially significant witness came forward. Margaret Simmons, an elderly woman who lived in an apartment with a view of Sycamore Hall, claimed to have seen a man climbing out of a window around 1 a.m. on the night of the murder. She described him as being of average height and wearing dark clothing. She couldn't give the detectives any more specifics that might help them figure out who he was. I didn't think much of it at the time, she told them. I just figured it was some kid sneaking out after seeing his girlfriend late at night. It wasn't until I heard about Catherine that I wondered if there was a connection. While Simmons's story lined up with when Catherine was thought to have died, the information she gave was too vague to be of much use, according to the investigators. They went back to the area and asked if anyone else had seen anything strange that night, but no one else came forward. By September 1971, 6 months after Catherine was killed, the investigation had pretty much come to a standstill. Detective Mullins and his team had looked into 124 different leads, talked to 201 people, and gathered 97 pieces of evidence. They had come up with and thrown out dozens of theories, followed leads that seemed promising but didn't pan out, and tried every possible way to investigate using the methods available in the 1970s. Sheriff Hayward had the difficult job of telling the Fitzgerald family that their daughter's case was being put on hold, which was the official way of saying it was a cold case. "It was the toughest conversation I've ever had," Hayward said later. "Michael Fitzgerald just stared at me, his eyes blank. Elizabeth held her husband's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. They didn't cry or yell. They just nodded, like they had been expecting this to happen all along. Their quiet strength was more heartbreaking than any outburst could have been. The Fitzgeralds had one request, that all the evidence be kept forever, no matter how unimportant it seemed. Sheriff Hayward promised them that he would, a promise that would keep 1971 connected to 2019 through a series of carefully stored evidence boxes, waiting for science to catch up and speak for a victim who had been silenced. If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button so others can find it too. The forensic techniques that eventually solved this case are truly groundbreaking, and you won't want to miss what's coming up. What time is it where you are? It's amazing to think that while you're watching from different time zones around the world, Catherine's killer spent almost 50 years checking his watch every day, maybe wondering if that would be the day he was finally caught. After Catherine's funeral, the Fitzgerald family returned to their home in Charleston to find it filled with casseroles, sympathy cards, and the heavy feeling of unanswered questions. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who used to be a lively piano teacher with 27 students, stopped giving lessons. Michael Fitzgerald took a 6-month break from his job at the highway department, and when he came back, he was a shadow of his former self. The first year was all about surviving, Catherine's younger sister, Margaret Fitzgerald, said in an interview in 2010. Mom would set the dinner table for 4, then stop when she realized it should be 3. Dad would start sentences with, "When Kathy comes home for Christmas," then just trail off. We lived in a house haunted not by Catherine's ghost, but by her absence. For the Fitzgeralds, getting justice became a family mission that lasted for generations. When the active investigation was stopped in September 1971, Michael Fitzgerald started keeping detailed records in a series of leather-bound journals. He wrote down every conversation he had with law enforcement, every newspaper article, every possible lead, no matter how small. By the time he died in 1994, these journals filled 17 volumes, a father's desperate attempt to solve what the authorities couldn't. Elizabeth dealt with her grief in a different way. In 1973, she started West Virginia Families for Justice, a group that advocated for families of unsolved murder victims. The organization pushed for better laws about keeping evidence, longer time limits for bringing charges, and more money for cold case units. What started as 4 grieving families meeting in the Fitzgerald's living room grew to over 300 members by the 1990s, becoming a powerful voice in changing the criminal justice system in the state. "My daughter's killer took more than just her life," Elizabeth told the West Virginia legislature when she testified for a bill in 1978 that would eventually create the state's first cold case review team. "He took our peace, our trust in the world, our sense of order. But he will not take our determination to see justice done, whether it takes years or decades." Margaret, who was only 16 when her sister was killed, found her life changed forever. She gave up her plans to study literature and instead went to law school, graduating from West Virginia University in 1980. She joined the Kanawha County Prosecutor's Office, specializing in violent crimes. While ethical rules prevented her from working directly on her sister's case, Margaret became a strong advocate for victims' rights throughout the state. "I couldn't save Catherine," she explained in her first press interview after becoming an assistant prosecutor. "But I can make sure other families don't experience the helplessness we felt in Cabell County." Catherine's case remained officially open, but it was mostly forgotten as new crimes took priority. Detective Frank Mullins, who had led the original investigation, asked to review the case every year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, something he did until he retired in 1992. Frank never let it go, said James Thornon, who was a junior detective under Mullins. Every March 16, he'd pull out the files, spread everything out on the conference table, and go through it all again. Sometimes he'd find some little thing we'd missed, but mostly it was his way of telling Catherine she wasn't forgotten. The case files themselves went on a physical journey that reflected the ups and downs of the investigation. They were first kept in the active case room at the Cabell County Sheriff's Department, then moved to the basement archives in 1972, and then to the new county records facility in 1985. During a flood in 1997, a deputy sheriff reportedly carried the Fitzgerald evidence boxes to higher ground on his shoulders, not letting anyone else touch them. The media covered the case on and off over the years, usually when there was a significant anniversary. The 5-year mark in 1976 brought a week-long series in the Huntington Herald-Dispatch called Justice Delayed, The Catherine Fitzgerald Mystery. The 10th anniversary in 1981 saw the first television documentary about the case, produced by a Charleston station and featuring interviews with investigators and family members. By the 20th anniversary in 1991, Catherine's murder had gone from a recent tragedy to a local legend. The Marshall University student newspaper published a story that accidentally had several factual errors, showing how the details had started to get mixed up in people's minds. The article led to a strong letter from Elizabeth Fitzgerald, correcting the record and reminding readers that this is not folklore. This is our ongoing nightmare. The 25th anniversary in 1996 happened at the same time that DNA analysis was becoming a forensic tool. This new technology sparked new interest in the case, with local media wondering if Catherine's murder might finally be solved using this revolutionary technique. Sheriff William Donovan, who had been a rookie deputy when Catherine was killed, authorized the first cold case review of the Fitzgerald murder in 1996. A team of 4 detectives spent 6 weeks looking at every piece of evidence again and interviewing surviving witnesses again. Their findings, while not leading to an arrest, did result in the evidence being repackaged using modern preservation methods. The skin samples from under Catherine's fingernails were our most promising biological evidence, explained forensic technician Sandra Morris, who oversaw the repackaging. In 1971, they were stored in a paper envelope. We transferred them to sterile containers and properly refrigerated them. If there was DNA present, we gave it the best chance of survival. The first actual DNA testing of evidence from Catherine's case happened in 1998, but the technology was still new. The tests used up valuable sample material but didn't give any clear results. It was a huge setback that almost destroyed the biological evidence before it could be analyzed with more advanced techniques. We were ahead of the science, Sheriff Donovan said at a press conference announcing the disappointing results. But we've preserved what remains for future testing. This case will be solved. It's just a matter of when the technology catches up to our determination. As the investigation kept stopping and starting, Cabell County itself went through big changes. The Marshall satellite campus where Catherine had studied grew into a full regional center before being merged back into the main university system in 1989. Sycamore Hall, the dorm where she was murdered, was torn down in 2001 to make way for a modern residential complex. This event caused another brief surge of media coverage about the unsolved case. The town of Milton grew from a rural community of 3,000 to a suburban extension of Huntington with nearly 10,000 residents by 2010. The influx of new residents meant that more and more people didn't know about Catherine's story, even though they lived where it had happened. Local schools started including the case in West Virginia history classes, making sure that new generations would remember what longtime residents couldn't forget. Throughout these decades of change, Catherine's murder continued to affect local law enforcement procedures and policies. The case became a warning story taught to every new officer in the county, emphasizing how important it was to collect and preserve evidence properly. Before Fitzgerald, we treated evidence like it only needed to last until trial, explained Police Academy instructor Robert Jenkins in 2005. After Fitzgerald, we began treating evidence like it might need to speak for the victim 50 years later. That fundamental shift in thinking has helped solve dozens of cases that might otherwise have gone cold. The case also led to significant security improvements at educational institutions throughout West Virginia. In 1972, directly responding to Catherine's murder, the State Board of Education ordered enhanced security measures for all campus dormitories, including electronic key systems, visitor registration protocols, and 24-hour security staffing. These standards, which were groundbreaking at the time, became models for campus safety nationwide. By the 30th anniversary in 2001, the investigation had been officially reviewed 5 times, each time using new forensic techniques as they became available. Fingerprints were run through automated identification systems. Fibers were analyzed using electron microscopes. Witness statements were evaluated using statement analysis protocols that didn't exist in 1971. The 40th anniversary in 2011 was a turning point in how the case was seen by both the public and law enforcement. What had once been talked about as a tragedy that might be solved someday was increasingly viewed as a cold case that might never be resolved. The Herald-Dispatch's anniversary coverage that year had the sad headline, "For decades later, has justice for Catherine Fitzgerald become impossible?" Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who was then 84 and in failing health, gave what many thought would be her last interview about her daughter's case. "I've accepted that I may not live to see Catherine's killer brought to justice," she told the newspaper. "But I believe that day will come. Science advances. People's consciences bother them as they age. Secrets become harder to keep. Someone knows something. And someday that knowledge will come to light." What Elizabeth couldn't have known was that the breakthrough was already starting to happen through a revolutionary way of analyzing DNA that would change cold case investigations around the world. In 2012, the FBI launched an upgrade to the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, that increased the genetic markers used in DNA profiling from 13 to 20, greatly improving the system's ability to identify people. The following year, the first successful use of familial DNA searching in a U.S. criminal case showed how investigators could identify suspects through the genetic information of their relatives. By 2018, genetic genealogy, which is using commercial DNA databases to identify criminal suspects through family connections, had become a powerful new tool in cold case investigations. The arrest of the Golden State Killer that April, solving crimes that went back to the 1970s, sent shockwaves through both the law enforcement community and the public. In Cabell County, these developments were watched with great interest by Detective Sarah Keller, who had taken over the Fitzgerald case file in 2015. Keller was a meticulous investigator with special training in cold case methods. She had spent her first 3 years on the case putting all the records and evidence documentation into a digital format, creating the first complete electronic database of the investigation. "The Fitzgerald case has never been about not having enough evidence," Keller explained in a department memo requesting money for advanced DNA testing in late 2018. "It's been about not being able to connect that evidence to a specific person. The genetic genealogy techniques that identified the Golden State Killer could be our way to finally bring Catherine's killer to justice." Her request was approved in January 2019, starting the final chapter of a story that had begun almost 5 decades earlier. As the evidence was carefully packaged to be sent to a specialized laboratory, no one involved could have guessed how quickly Catherine's killer would be identified, or how shocking that identification would be. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who had remained quietly determined to get justice for 48 years, would live just long enough to see her daughter's killer identified. The woman who had founded an advocacy organization, testified before lawmakers, and kept her daughter's memory alive through decades of disappointment, would finally get the answer she had been looking for since that terrible March morning in 1971. On February 12, 2019, Detective Sarah Keller carefully sealed the evidence package containing skin samples from beneath Catherine Fitzgerald's fingernails. The package, which was about the size of a paperback book but treated with the respect of a sacred object, was the last best hope for solving a case that had haunted 3 generations of law enforcement officers. "I remember thinking, this is it," Keller said later. "Either this works, or we accept that Catherine's case might never be solved." The samples were headed to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, one of a few private laboratories that specialized in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. This revolutionary approach to DNA analysis had come from an unexpected combination of recreational ancestry testing, big data analysis, and traditional forensic science. Unlike regular DNA testing, which requires a direct match in criminal databases, genetic genealogy could identify suspects through their distant relatives. People who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to commercial ancestry services for completely different reasons. The technique had already solved dozens of cold cases nationwide since it was first used successfully in 2018, many of which were decades old. Traditional DNA analysis is like trying to find someone using only their exact address, explained Dr. Ellen Graytack, the forensic genetic genealogist assigned to Catherine's case. Genetic genealogy is like being able to find someone by finding their cousins and then figuring out where they must live based on those family connections. It greatly expands our search capabilities. The process began with extracting usable DNA from the skin samples that had been preserved since 1971. This was the first major challenge. The samples had broken down a lot over 48 years, even though multiple evidence custodians had carefully preserved them. We received approximately 0.4 nanograms of highly fragmented DNA, DR. Graytack noted in her preliminary report. Under normal circumstances, this would be insufficient for analysis. However, advances in amplification techniques allowed us to work with this limited material. Using a process called whole genome amplification, the laboratory made enough copies of the DNA fragments to proceed with analysis. The team then created a DNA profile that focused on hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, far more than the 20 markers used in standard law enforcement databases. This expanded profile was compared against profiles in public genetic databases, where users had chosen to make their information available for law enforcement matching. The initial comparison didn't find any direct matches, but it identified 17 individuals who shared enough genetic markers with the crime scene DNA to be distant relatives of the killer. These weren't close relatives like siblings or children, Dr. Graytack explained. They were primarily third and fourth cousins, people who likely had never met the perpetrator but shared great-great-grandparents. From these distant connections, the genetic genealogy team began the painstaking process of building family trees. Working backward through historical records, they identified common ancestors among the matching individuals, then worked forward through birth, marriage, and death certificates to construct a comprehensive family structure spanning multiple generations. "It's like solving a massive puzzle where you don't know what the final picture looks like," said Dr. Graytack. "We were essentially mapping the killer's extended family without knowing who the killer was." By late March 2019, the team had constructed family trees containing over 2,400 individuals across 7 generations. They then began narrowing the field by applying filters based on what was known about the killer: male, likely between 18 and 40 years old in 1971, and with some connection to Cabell County, West Virginia. This filtering process reduced the pool to 38 potential suspects. Further refinement based on geographical location during the time of the murder narrowed the list to just 7 men who were in the right place at the right time with the right genetic connections. Detective Keller received the short list on April 2, 2019. "When I opened that email, I expected to see a list of names I'd never encountered before," she recalled. "Instead, I found myself staring at several names that appeared throughout our case files, including one that made my blood run cold." Third on the list was David Kowalski, age 78, current resident of Huntington, West Virginia. A quick search of the digitized case files revealed that Kowalski had been interviewed during the original 1971 investigation, not as a suspect, but as a witness. At the time, he was a 30-year-old chemistry teacher at the local high school, who occasionally guest lectured at the Marshall Satellite Campus. Kowalski had told investigators he occasionally tutored Catherine in advanced chemistry, though he claimed their relationship was strictly professional. His statement indicated he had last seen her 2 weeks before her murder. He provided an alibi of being home with his wife on the night of the murder, which was confirmed at the time, with no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene and no obvious motive. Investigators had quickly moved on to more promising suspects. What struck me immediately was how peripheral he seemed in the original investigation, said Keller. He was interviewed as a routine part of canvassing Catherine's instructors. His name appears exactly twice in over 2,000 pages of case notes. Before approaching Kowalski directly, Keller needed to confirm the genetic connection. Instead of requesting a DNA sample that might alert him to the investigation, she used a technique that had become standard in genetic genealogy cases: covert collection of discarded DNA. For 3 days, surveillance teams monitored Kowalski's movements, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came when he visited a local coffee shop, leaving behind a paper cup that was quickly retrieved by an undercover officer. The cup was rushed to the state crime laboratory, where technicians extracted a DNA sample from saliva residue on the rim. The results came back on April 7. The DNA from Kowalski's coffee cup matched the DNA from under Catherine's fingernails with a probability of 99.9998%. After 48 years, Catherine Fitzgerald's killer had a name. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the report, feeling this strange mix of elation and horror, Keller said. Elation because we finally had our answer. Horror because of who that answer turned out to be. The horror came not just from solving the case, but from what investigators discovered as they dug into Kowalski's life over the 5 decades since Catherine's murder. Far from being a shadowy figure lurking at the edges of society, David Kowalski had become a pillar of the Cabell County community. After teaching high school chemistry for 12 years, he had joined the Marshall University faculty in 1983, eventually becoming chair of the chemistry department before retiring in 2009. He had served on the Milton City Council for 3 terms in the 1990s. He had coached youth soccer for nearly 2 decades. The local Rotary Club had named him Citizen of the Year in 1997 for his community service. Most disturbingly, Kowalski had maintained connections to the Fitzgerald family over the years. He had attended Catherine's funeral in 1971. He had made small but regular donations to the scholarship fund established in her name. He had even served alongside Elizabeth Fitzgerald on a 1985 Governor's Task Force for Campus Safety Improvements, looking her in the eye while carrying the secret of her daughter's murder. The level of deception required to live that kind of double life for nearly 5 decades is almost incomprehensible, said Dr. Illa Cassidy, a forensic psychologist consulted during the final phase of the investigation. This wasn't someone who committed a crime and then disappeared. This was someone who remained embedded in the very community traumatized by his actions, who crafted an identity as a respected citizen while knowing the truth about himself. With the DNA match confirmed, Detective Keller assembled a team to plan Kowalski's arrest. The operation would need to be handled carefully, not only because of Kowalski's age and community standing, but because of the media frenzy that would inevitably follow the resolution of such a high-profile cold case. On January 15, 2019, as dawn broke over Huntington, 6 unmarked police vehicles surrounded the modest 2-story home where David Kowalski had lived for over 40 years. As officers approached his door, none could have anticipated the final twists this case would take or how the community would react to learning that a monster had been hiding among them all along. The identity of the killer will shock you. Comment below with your theories about how David Kowalski managed to evade justice for so long. Was it calculated brilliance, institutional failures, or simply luck that allowed him to live freely while Catherine's family suffered for decades? When David Kowalski opened his front door on that January morning in 2019, he faced Detective Sarah Keller and 5 officers with an expression that witnesses would later describe as resigned recognition. He offered no resistance as they read him his rights, placed him in handcuffs, and escorted him to a waiting police vehicle. His only words were directed to his wife of 47 years. "Call Attorney Simmons. Tell him it's about the Fitzgerald girl." News of Kowalski's arrest spread through Cabell County with the speed and force of a shockwave. By noon, every local news outlet had broken the story, many struggling to reconcile the beloved community figure with the cold-blooded killer now revealed. Former students, colleagues, and neighbors expressed disbelief, creating a cognitive dissonance that would define the community's response in the days to come. "It can't be Dr. K," insisted former student Jason Reynolds in a television interview. "He was the gentlest man I knew. He wrote my college recommendation letter. He attended my wedding." Yet, the evidence told a different story, one that became clearer as investigators pieced together Kowalski's movements on the night of March 15, 1971, and his life in the decades that followed. In 1971, David Kowalski was a 30-year-old high school chemistry teacher with ambitions of joining the university faculty. Married for just 2 years to his wife Diane, he supplemented their income by tutoring college students and occasionally guest lecturing at the Marshall Satellite Campus. His reputation was that of a strict but fair instructor with a particular talent for explaining complex concepts. What no one knew was that Kowalski had developed an inappropriate fixation on Catherine Fitzgerald after meeting her at a campus lecture series. Catherine's diary, re-examined after Kowalski's arrest, contained brief mentions of Mr. K offering extra help with chemistry concepts, interactions she viewed as purely academic but which investigators now believe Kowalski interpreted differently. Based on the evidence, we believe Kowalski visited Catherine's room that night under the pretense of discussing an upcoming chemistry exam, Detective Keller explained at a press conference following the arrest. "The coffee cup suggests she offered him coffee," she continued, suggesting the visit was not unwelcome at first. "He was welcomed as a trusted instructor. Something during that interaction, most likely a rejection of romantic advances, unleashed the violence that followed." After strangling Catherine, Kowalski meticulously wiped down every surface he had touched. He even took the second coffee cup, which was never recovered. Then, he calmly walked out the dorm's main entrance during a shift change, time when security was momentarily lax. He went home to his wife, who later told investigators that she had taken sleep medication that night and couldn't remember when her husband came to bed. The most unsettling part of the case wasn't even the murder itself, but Kowalski's behavior in the 50 years that followed. Instead of running away or hiding, he did the opposite. He became even more involved in the community, carefully crafting an identity that made him seem above suspicion. "This wasn't just a disguise, it was a complete transformation," explained forensic psychologist Dr. Ella Cassidy. "Kowalski didn't just try to disappear. He remade himself into someone people would automatically trust. It's a level of cold-blooded deception you rarely see, even in psychopaths." In the years after Catherine's murder, Kowalski's career took off. He earned a PhD in chemistry by attending night classes, then joined the faculty at Marshall University in 1983, eventually becoming the head of the department. He published respected research papers, mentored tons of students, and won awards for his teaching. His community service was just as impressive: youth sports coach, city council member, church deacon, and a regular volunteer for local charities. But the most chilling thing was that Kowalski maintained a connection to the case itself. He went to memorial services on important anniversaries of Catherine's death. He even gave quotes to newspaper articles about how the unsolved murder had affected the community. In 1991, he even sat on a panel to discuss the campus safety improvements that had been put in place after the tragedy. "He didn't just get away with murder," Margaret Fitzgerald said after Kowalski was arrested. He used my sister's death to build himself up as a caring, concerned citizen. That kind of calculated cruelty is almost harder to wrap my head around than the murder itself. When Kowalski's house was searched after his arrest, police found a hidden collection of newspaper clippings about the case, carefully preserved in acid-free sleeves and arranged in order. They also found a small box with what looked like the missing coffee cup from Catherine's room, wrapped in a handkerchief, hidden behind a fake wall in his basement workshop. He kept trophies, Detective Keller pointed out, not out in the open, but hidden where only he could get to them. It's like he was mentally reliving the crime his whole life. As the community tried to come to terms with these revelations, many people struggled to reconcile the David Kowalski they knew with the monster he had turned out to be. Former students talked about how patient and encouraging he was. Neighbors remembered him shoveling snow and mowing lawns for older residents. Fellow church members mentioned his generous donations to mission trips and food pantries. The hardest thing for a lot of people to accept, said Mayor Robert Jenkins, who had served on the city council with Kowalski in the 1990s, is that both versions of this man were real. The mentor who helped so many students succeed and the killer who took Catherine's life. They were both the same person. Our community is really struggling with that contradiction. What's the weather like where you are today? As this story unfolds in all its complexity, I'm curious about the conditions where you're watching from. Perhaps a reminder that while we're connected through this narrative, we're experiencing it from different places. Just as the people of Cabell County experienced different versions of the man they thought they knew. The Cabell County Courthouse had never seen anything like the media circus that showed up for David Kowalski's arraignment on January 17, 2019. News vans were parked all along the streets, satellite dishes filled the courthouse lawn, and journalists from national news outlets fought for seats in the courtroom with the local reporters. The case had become more than just a local story, it was now a national story about justice delayed but not denied. Inside the courtroom, Kowalski looked like a shadow of his former self. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs instead of his academic robes and awards. At 78 years old, he was stooped over and his white hair was thinning. But his eyes were still sharp, scanning the courtroom with the same analytical look he had used to evaluate chemistry experiments and students for decades. Judge Martha Simmons, who had been one of Kowalski's students herself, immediately recused herself from the case. The integrity of these proceedings must be beyond question, she stated before handing the case over to Judge William Harmon from nearby Wayne County. Kowalski pleaded not guilty, but his lawyer's actions after that suggested it was just a formality. Within days, his lawyer, Thomas Simmons, had started talking to the prosecutors about a possible plea deal. Those talks got more serious after the DNA results were confirmed by a second independent lab. Meanwhile, the community's reaction had gone beyond just shock. Cabell County was now divided between those who couldn't believe the beloved teacher could be a cold-blooded killer and those who felt betrayed by years of lies. 2 makeshift memorials popped up. Flowers were left at the site of Catherine's old dorm, and angry messages were taped to the chemistry building with Kowalski's name on a donor plaque. Marshall University quickly distanced itself from their former professor, taking his name off an annual chemistry scholarship and creating a new fellowship in Catherine Fitzgerald's memory. The city council voted to take back his Citizen of the Year award from 1997. Former colleagues released statements saying how horrified and shocked they were. "We're all questioning everything now," said Dr. Robert Chen, the current head of the chemistry department. "How many students did we send to his office alone? How many young women sought his mentorship? The betrayal goes beyond Catherine to every single person who trusted him for over 50 years." For the Fitzgerald family, Kowalski's arrest brought a mix of emotions. Elizabeth Fitzgerald, who was now 92 and living in an assisted living facility, got the news from Detective Keller in person. She just nodded very calmly, Keller remembered. Then she said, "I knew I would live to see this day." It wasn't happy or sad. It was just a simple statement from a woman who had always believed justice would come. Margaret Fitzgerald, now 64 and recently retired from her legal career, became the family's spokesperson. At a press conference after the arraignment, she spoke with the measured tone of someone who had spent her whole life in courtrooms. For 48 years, we've lived with an absence, she told the reporters. The absence of Catherine and the absence of answers. Today, half of that hole has been filled. We now know who took Catherine from us. But the bigger absence is still there, and no arrest or conviction can bring back the years of life that were stolen from my sister or from our family. When she was asked how she felt about Kowalski, Margaret's composure almost broke. I sat across from him at community events. I made small talk with him at university functions. I even thanked him once for donating to Catherine's scholarship fund. The calculated cruelty of his deception is almost harder to process than the murder itself. On March 15, 2019. Exactly 48 years after Catherine's murder, David Kowalski accepted a plea agreement. In exchange for pleading guilty to first-degree murder, the prosecutors agreed not to pursue any other charges related to evidence tampering and obstruction of justice, which could have dragged the legal process out for years. The sentencing hearing on April 30 was packed. The courthouse opened 2 extra rooms with video feeds so everyone who wanted to could watch the final chapter. Among them were former students, colleagues, neighbors, and dozens of cold case detectives from all over the country, who had come to see the end of a case that had become legendary in law enforcement. Judge Harmon allowed the Fitzgerald family to make impact statements before announcing the sentence. Michael Fitzgerald Jr., Catherine's nephew, who had never met the aunt he was named after, talked about the legacy of grief that had shaped his family for generations. Elizabeth Fitzgerald was too weak to come in person, so Margaret read her statement. To the man who took my daughter, you stole not just Catherine's future, but pieces of all who loved her. For 48 years, I have carried the weight of her absence, while you built a life of freedom and respect. I do not hate you. Hate would only take more from me than you've already taken. Instead, I pity the emptiness inside you that allowed such cruelty to exist alongside such a pretense of goodness. When Kowalski was given the chance to speak, he slowly got to his feet. The courtroom went silent as he adjusted his glasses. A familiar gesture to former students that now seemed sinister. I have no explanation or justification to offer, he said, his voice calm despite the circumstances. I have lived 2 lives. One visible to all, one known only to myself. I cannot undo what I did to Catherine Fitzgerald. I can only acknowledge it now at the end of my life, when such acknowledgement comes far too late to matter to anyone but historians of this case. Judge Harmon sentenced Kowalski to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence allowed. At 78, and with his health failing. Everyone knew this meant Kowalski would die in prison. As he was being led out of the courtroom, some people noticed that he turned briefly toward the Fitzgerald family and made eye contact with Margaret before the deputies escorted him out the side door. In the months that followed the sentencing, Catherine's case went from being an unsolved mystery to a teaching tool. The FBI added it to their training program as an example of how genetic genealogy could solve decades-old cases. Forensic science programs used it in discussions about evidence preservation. Law enforcement agencies all over the country looked at their own cold case files with renewed hope. For Cabell County, the case led to a community-wide examination of conscience. The university created an ethics center that focused on professional responsibility and moral courage. Local schools developed lesson plans about the case, teaching students about both the tragedy and the scientific breakthroughs that eventually solved it. The site of Catherine's dorm was turned into a memorial garden dedicated to victims of violence. Catherine Fitzgerald's legacy went beyond her tragic death to include the scientific progress her case inspired, the advocacy organization her mother founded, the legal career her sister pursued, and the countless cold cases that would be solved using techniques that were pioneered in solving hers. On the first anniversary of Kowalski's sentencing, Elizabeth Fitzgerald passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her obituary, written by Margaret, noted that she died having finally seen the justice she had been seeking for nearly 5 decades. Her life's mission was complete. If you want more solved cold cases like this one, subscribe to our channel. Every week, we explore how modern science and dedicated investigators are bringing closure to families who have waited years, sometimes decades, for answers. From genetic genealogy breakthroughs to advanced forensic techniques, we'll take you inside the investigations that are rewriting cold case history one DNA strand at a time. The cold January morning in 2019 dawned with an unsettling event on Maple Street. 6 unmarked police cruisers quietly rolled up to a modest 2-story house in Huntington, West Virginia. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as officers in tactical gear took positions around the property. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski was preparing his morning coffee, a ritual he had followed for nearly 5 decades, having been a respected high school teacher, community volunteer, and beloved grandfather to 4 grandchildren. The sharp rap at his door came at precisely 7:32 a.m. David Kowalski? West Virginia State Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1971 murder of Catherine Fitzgerald. The officers later recounted how the elderly man's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set down his coffee mug, yet his face remained eerily calm, as if he had been anticipating this moment for a lifetime. March 6.